Okie doke. The feeding of the 5,000. What can you do about that? Can you actually, what grounds would you have for believing it? It's a tremendous miracle, and so a lot of people are naturally sceptical about it. So what sort of evidence could we possibly come up with to support the historicity of the feeding of the 5,000? Well, then, just an overview of the New Testament. The New Testament starts with 4 Gospels, and there's a poem, a nursery rhyme, that starts, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, bless this bed that I lay on. So Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are the first 4 books of the New Testament, and they are called Gospels. And now each Gospel provides unique material. For instance, some stories only occur in one of the Gospels, such as the story of the prodigal son, which is only found in Luke. But some of it is repeated. And so if you go through and read the 4 Gospels, you start with Matthew, and you say, oh, this is interesting. Then you start to read Mark, and you say, oh, I've heard some of this before. Then you read Luke, and you say, oh, I've read some of this before. This is getting boring to read the same old material over and over again. But this material that is repeated is actually an opportunity for learning some very interesting stuff. So we are so blessed in that we have 4 witnesses to the life of Jesus instead of just 1. And so I guess this business about having 4 Gospels is expressed in this cartoon. Okay, everyone, now listen carefully. I don't want to end up with 4 different versions of this. Well, we do have 4 different versions of this, and we're so lucky that we do. Now, there's 2 ways that you can actually read the Gospels. One is called vertically, and the other is called horizontally. I'm not sure who calls it that, but I call it that, so this is a classification that I'm going to use. So what I call reading it vertically is to just read it straight through in sequence. So it's reading each Gospel individually from start to end. And this is a normal way that it should be read. So if you do it that way, don't feel ashamed. That's what you're meant to do. So each Gospel writer has something unique to say, and their sequence of expressing this supports their unique perspective. They ordered their material in that way for their own purposes, for what they wanted to get across. But the other way to look at the Gospels is to look at them horizontally. So that means kind of getting a particular narrative and comparing that narrative or pericope across the Gospels to see the different perspectives of each Gospel writer on the same event. So this is comparing how each Gospel writer tells the same story. Much of it is very similar, but there are also differences. Now, these differences can be good or bad. They're a potential source of Gospel writers contradicting each other when they cover the same event. But as well, there's opportunities too. They may provide additional material that others don't, and they also provide different perspectives on the same event. And so this can be extremely valuable. This is a topic that Jeff has spoken on a couple of times, called undesigned coincidences. And I've kind of followed up and looked at it, and I think it's a really good thing. And it's an area which I have plans to do more detail on later on. And also Jeff is going to cover it in other ways as well too. So undesigned coincidences is that each writer provides independent details that interlock with other Gospel writers. So this is a type of evidence that detectives and lawyers look for to identify genuine eyewitness accounts. So these are called undesigned coincidences. There are many examples of these in the Bible, but tonight we're just going to illustrate it with just one event. And this event is the feeding of the 5,000. This is a kind of a pre-cross narrative or miracle that's reported in all four Gospels. And it's one of the few events that is reported by all four Gospels. And it is that Jesus feeds 5,000 people from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So this is a huge miracle, and so many people immediately dismiss it as a complete fable. Now, each of the 4 narratives has got many strong similarities, but there's also subtle independent differences. And it's these differences which are really interesting, and which probably you've never even noticed. First of all, we'll look at Mark, because Mark is supposedly the first gospel to be written. Now, I'm going to read out, sorry, I wasn't paying attention to, do you want to help me here? So here's my pretty assistant, and he will make sure that we keep up on the slides overhead, so it's the same as what I see here. All right, I'm now on to the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so here is Mark's account from chapter 6, and I've kind of helped you by putting in a little bit of bold so that you can take notice of the particular points that I'd like to highlight. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognised them and ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Right. Notice all it says 5,000 men. Okay? Very sexist. All right, here is the account from Matthew chapter 14. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Ho-hum, boring, heard it before. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, They need not go away. You give them something to eat. They said to him, We only have 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, Bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over, and those who ate it were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Other translations say not counting women and children. So if you're a male over 18 years old, put your hand up. Now let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I do a committee report and I report on attendance. So next time I report the attendance at Reasonable Faith, I'll say there were 12 men, not counting women and children. Okay? So how would you like that? So my apologies to the ladies.
It is International Women's Day.
Is it? That's worse. Now, Matthew follows Mark very closely. He does that in a lot of things. So there's not a lot of difference between Matthew and Mark. But we'll move on to Luke. On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done. And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came and said to him, "Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions. For we are here in a desolate place." Heard that before. But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we're to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." Come on in. And they did so and had them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So it's Luke. All right? A couple of little differences there. Now John. Boring. Heard it all before. But this John is slightly different. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for I think you've picked up on it already, haven't you?
In Israel, you cannot buy bread at the time of the Passover.
Okay. All right, so that's all right. Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. That's a point I hadn't picked up. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the disciples saw the sign that he had done, they said, This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." All right, So I've kind of helped you. What are some of the differences that you've seen between the accounts? It's a bit hard to memorise them, so I'm going to gather them together. These are the points I'd like to focus on. There are many differences, and some of them are not, don't support the argument that I'm trying to develop. They don't deny it, neither, but they're not useful for them to support the argument. But these are the points that I'd like to highlight. First of all, the green grass. Then the issue is who actually sat down. Then there's a reference to the mountain. And the issue, why did Jesus ask Philip? And the town of Bethsaida. First of all, the green grass. Matthew, Mark and John all state that the people sat on the grass. Mark says that the grass was green. John says that there was much grass. John states that the event occurred at the time of Passover. Passover is at Easter, which is April. So in the southern hemisphere, April occurs in autumn. So in the northern hemisphere, April occurs in spring. So Galilee has a Mediterranean climate, which is very similar to South Australia. So you get, it mainly rains in the winter, and the summers are hot and dry. And it is greenest in spring, just after the summer rains, when it's starting to warm up, and that's when you get the green grass. So contrast this with the feeding of the 4,000, which is reported in Matthew and Mark. It doesn't say that they sat down on the grass, it says they sat down on the ground. Because in Galilee and Israel, it's pretty hot and dry and barren. And there's very rarely a time when there is green grass, but it occurs in spring. So the feeding of the 5,000 occurred in spring at the time of the Passover when the grass is green. So some said there was green grass, others say it was the Passover. One account also says that there were many people coming and going. So this is actually characteristic of the Passover because you actually had many visitors come to Jerusalem. And the western side of the Galilee was the main travelling route. And so Josephus claims that nearly 3 million Jews in Jerusalem were in Jerusalem for the Passover. This is probably a huge exaggeration, but the point is there's a huge number of people come to Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. And yeah, I went out of order because I'm doing this on the fly. So you've got multiple perspectives from each of the Gospels which identify the time at which the event occurred. So some say the grass is green, one says it's Passover, another says many were coming and going. So all three perspectives support this, support the time at which the event occurred. Who sat down? Luke and Mark state that the crowd sat down in groups of 50 or 100. John states that only the men sat down. And so if the men sat down in groups of 50 or 100, they were easily countable. So Matthew states that there were 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So this together, the fact that only the men sat down in groups of 50 or 100 allowed the men easily to be counted. And so that's why it says there are about 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The mountain. Only John mentions the mountain. So what are we going to get out of that? It says Jesus went up on the mountain. None of the other Gospels mentions the mountain. But Mark and Matthew do mention it incidentally. Because after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus commanded his disciples to get into a boat and travel across to where they came from. And what did he do after that? He went up on the mountain to pray. So it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So John says that he went up on the mountain for the feeding of the 5,000. And the others don't mention that, but they do infer that the mountain was there. So Matthew and Mark do not explicitly mention that Jesus went up on the mountain for the feeding of the 5,000, but they do confirm that the mountain was at least nearby.
Sea of Galilee is surrounded by hills. It
Yeah.
is the location where it is.
Yeah. Now, why did Jesus ask Philip? Matthew, Mark and Luke all record Jesus as saying, you give them something to eat. But only in the Gospel of John does Jesus address this specifically to Philip. Why Philip? He is a minor disciple. John mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Now only Luke records that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred at Bethsaida. All right, so you've got multiple perspectives. Jesus asked Philip. Why ask Philip? Elsewhere it says that Philip was from Bethsaida. Luke says that the feeding of 5,000 occurred at Bethsaida. So only Luke records that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred at Bethsaida. So Luke makes sense of John. Jesus picked on Philip because it was Philip's hometown region. Jesus was in effect asking Philip, where is the local fish and chip shop? Okay? So Bethsaida. This is a bit of a digression. Where was Bethsaida? The existence of Bethsaida is undisputed. It's referred to outside the Bible by a number of sources. But its location is uncertain. So there are two proposed sites, both east of the Jordan. One is called El Tel. And if I have my pointing, you got me your pointing stick. El Tel is there. Nearly, left, there. That's El Tel, okay? And the other one is El Araj, and it's right on the shore of the Galilee. Go south, south. Now west. Stop. There it is. The little red rectangle there. Okay. So the favoured site at the moment is the second one, El Araj. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with the argument. But the point is, it's on the eastern side near the mouth of the Jordan. Matthew and Luke report Jesus pronouncing woes on Bethsaida. Matthew says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Luke says the similar sort of thing. It's almost identical, so I won't read it. But the interesting thing is that Matthew makes no other mention of Bethsaida in this gospel. That's his only mention of Bethsaida and Chorazin. And so it almost seems out of context. It almost seems out of context that why would Matthew mention Bethsaida and Chorazin when he makes no other mention of the towns in these Gospels? Why the woes? Mark reports the healing of the blind man in Bethsaida. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by his hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Now, Luke says that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred at Bethsaida. Mark records that Jesus healed the blind man at Bethsaida. So Mark and Luke incidentally support Matthew's statement. Do you see that? Like, if all the miracles that were done in Bethsaida, you would have repented long ago. Woe to you, Bethsaida. Chorazin is otherwise not mentioned, so there's no sinister plot to bolster Jesus' statement of woe. Chorazin is not mentioned in any of the four Gospels other than in that woe. So this strongly confirms that Jesus did declare the woe and that Jesus performed mighty works in Bethsaida. Now, there is a problem when you compare. I said there you can find some interesting supporting evidence, but you can also find contradictions. So there is a potential contradiction here. Comparing accounts can also reveal contradictions. Luke says that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred at Bethsaida. So on their return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. But not in the town, because it says, "Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place." So they're not actually in the town, they're in the region of Bethsaida. So it is probably a desolate place near Bethsaida. However, Mark provides us with a problem. He says the feeding occurred at a desolate place, but after the feeding of the 5,000, he commands the disciples to go to Bethsaida. So according to Mark, the feeding of the 5,000 occurred in any place except Bethsaida. It says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. So that seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? But the interesting thing about Mark is, even though he told them to go to Bethsaida, they didn't arrive at Bethsaida. It says, when they'd crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored on the shore. How come? The solution may be that to Bethsaida is a translation of the Greek pros Bethsaida. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Pros is a preposition of direction. It can mean forward, to, or towards. So it could be translated instead as towards Bethsaida and may just be a translation issue. So they may be at the desolate place, and he says travel towards Bethsaida, but then they arrived at Capernaum.
Gennesaret.
Sorry?
Gennesaret.
Gennesaret. Yeah. Well, there's actually slight differences. Gennesaret and Capernaum are very close together. And so it's probably in between Capernaum and Gennesaret. So what we've looked at so far is that the four Gospels corroborate each other in different ways without collaborating. So you can't say that any of these different perspectives were contrived or collaboration. It doesn't happen to all incidental information because these correspondences occur accidentally. For instance, in John, it says that there was a young boy who had the 5 loaves and the 4 fish. It's not mentioned in any of the other accounts, but as far as we can tell, it doesn't really help us in this argument. Okay? These are characteristics of historical events based on eyewitness accounts. The witnesses record different features that stuck in their minds. This does not happen in forgeries. You don't get this sort of characteristic happening in forgeries. These are independent, interlocking details that strongly confirm that the feeding of the 5,000 was based on a historical event. And there are many other instances like this where you can get these undesigned coincidences. So it's not immediately obvious, can be hard to find, but they are there for those who are willing to look. So seek and you'll find. So the Gospels are not fairy tales. They're not constructed by a committee to fool 21st century readers. They are based on eyewitness accounts about events that really happened. Now, when I've given this talk before at my church, and just that was on the Sunday, of course, and on the Saturday we had a men's group, and one guy got up and he extolled the virtues of this particular speaker because he told stuff that was relevant. And when I heard this, I thought, I've never said a relevant thing in my life, and what am I going to do? How am I going to get something that's relevant? After the feeding of the 5,000, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus went to Capernaum and he spoke in the synagogue. And he followed up with the account of the bread of life. But it has a little interesting twist right at the end. But anyway, if you're looking for an application of the story rather than stuff I've been talking about, then this passage gives it. Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world." Then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. And I'll raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever." Now, John is one of the characteristics of the Gospel of John are the I am statements. I am the resurrection, I am the good shepherd, I am the way, the truth and the life, I am the bread of life. These I am. So one of the interesting things is that the other 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, don't contain these statements. Only John does. And this has caused John to be questioned. If John said such things before Abraham was, I am, how come they're not in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark and Luke? And so people have actually inferred that John is putting words into Jesus' mouth. So, and saying, Jesus historically never said such things. And John is making a theological reflection and putting words into his mouth to express a theological point. It's an interesting argument. But look at the last sentence. He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. So what John is claiming here is that he's putting it into a historical context. So if he didn't say it, then John is a liar. Okay? So even there, you've got this little marker. They went feeding the 5,000 Bethsaida, then the disciples travelled across the lake, landed at Gennesaret, and he's at Capernaum.
All in the context of the past.
Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We've had an interesting talk this morning, and Kevin this evening, and Kevin's done a great job of just doing that almost on spec. So, thank you very much, Kevin, for that talk. Now, in the interest of tradition, I should ask the first question, shouldn't I? Isn't that what that is?
Right. That's right.
And I haven't been.
I have the right to say I don't know as well.
You haven't given me much opportunity to think up the curly questions. But yeah, it is very interesting that this is one of the few incidents in the New Testament period that is recorded in all four Gospels, and Kevin's brought out the differences between the similarities and the differences between the four accounts very well, and how that some of the differences do give us reason to believe that what is recorded there is actually historically reliable, that they are independent witnesses reporting on what they saw or heard from others who were witnesses of what actually happened. And so the kind of differences that are there are just what you'd expect from genuinely independent witnesses. That's a wonderful event. I've actually been to those parts around there as best they can be identified, which is not completely. And it's very interesting what you brought out about the green grass, that there's not green grass there very often in the year in Israel. It's interesting how one gospel writer writes one thing and another writes another thing, but they corroborate. Now, I need to think of a question.
Don't worry. I wasn't really worried about your question. I just knew what my answer would be. As a true politician, just tell them what you want to tell them. Don't answer the question. But one of the things I don't want to overstate my case from the point of view, I'm not saying that I provide good evidence that Jesus turned 5 loaves of 2 fish into a feast for 5,000. All I am claiming is that we've actually got evidence that there was a corresponding event. So the event took place, but it doesn't actually prove that Jesus multiplied the bread and the fish. But it is based on a historical event. Right.
Well, I'll throw it over to other people. Has anybody else got a question or comment?
Yeah. I've got a comment.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm the new guy. Hi, I'm Tony. Author and Macquarie University professor Dr. John Dixon has drawn reference to how the parallel Gospels, or the Gospels side by side, having slight differences, as he pointed out this evening, actually strengthens and reinforces the accounts from an eyewitness point of view, and he provides an excellent example in one of his books. I've forgotten the name of the book, but he gives an example when police are investigating witnesses of a car crash. They'll all report what they saw slightly differently. And the first witness will say, well, the car was metallic brown. And the next one will say, oh, it was silver. And the next person will say, oh, it was dark, I think it was black. And they'll all report the accounts slightly differently. One will say there were 2 people in the front, another witness will say there was 1 person in the front of the car. And no one can actually know what really happened because it was a hit and run. The car that caused the accident took off. And so all we have to go on is the 3 different eyewitness accounts, and they are all different. And Dr. John Dixon says, so too it is you'll find in the Gospels where accounts are nearly the same. And where you have minuscule differences like this, it doesn't matter when the police take down the report what colour the car was. That doesn't matter if it was brown or silver or black. What matters is that there was a hit and run, and that this is what happened. The vehicle looked like this. It was at that time of day approximately, and so on and so forth. So it's the same with these gospel accounts, that we can verify that they truly happened because these witness accounts are slightly different, as you pointed out this evening.
It's a bit different from just there being these eyewitnesses. There were different eyewitnesses, but also we know that just because of lots of Matthew and Luke is the same as Mark, and it was kind of copied in. So it's not quite the same as these 4 people were there and they all wrote it down afterwards, and look how similar and different they are. It's well, John was there because he was one of the 12 and he wrote it about a lot later, but Matthew and Luke are taking from Mark, but also taking from elsewhere, and that's given us the 4 we've got. So,
they're not entirely independent. They're kind of interdependent in a way. So partially dependent on common source and partly not. Yeah.
Kevin, it seems to me that the Gospel of St John has a much more detailed and extensive explanation of what happened. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I guess the obvious thing is that he claims to be an eyewitness, whereas the other 3 don't. But because I think that is explicitly claimed in the Gospel of John. Now, like many biblical critics deny that, but that's what the writer claims.
Okay, that's good.
Presumably, so Luke wasn't really there.
No,
He's actually
definitely
reporting it from a book I read. I read this somewhere.
Well, the first 4 verses.
Reporting it like I've read. So he's what I'm saying is to be a witness at this police accident, you would hope he's there.
No,
So,
well, he
you know what I'm
definitely
saying?
was not,
So
because
you're saying there's only one?
because he in the first 4 verses of Luke he writes a prologue, and he says that there were many eyewitnesses, many who'd written prior accounts. I did an orderly investigation, and investigation wrote an orderly account so that you may know what happened. So he's saying that he was reliant on other eyewitnesses and on other written records.
Halfway through Acts, which is also written by Luke, the same sort of forward, he changes from they to we, and he's with Paul at that stage. He joined the party, so Luke's very clear when he's an eyewitness, and he was an eyewitness for the second half of Acts, but not for the first half.
Yeah.
And he was the only one that talked to Jesus' mother, for example, and found out what the angel said to her and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, but if you actually trace Luke's movements, so the we passages turn off and on.
Yeah,
They do.
So they came on at Troas, stop at Philippi. Paul proceeds on his 2nd journey. On his 3rd journey, he goes across to Philippi, down to Corinth, back to Philippi, start again.
Yep.
And it's, the we passages go on until they get to Jerusalem. They stop when Paul gets imprisoned, and they start again when you go back to Rome. And it's we all the way to Rome.
We had a talk on that here a few years ago.
Yeah, but
you could make a nursery rhyme out of that.
yeah, that's right. But while Paul was in prison, they arrived at Jerusalem. Where was Luke? He was probably with the Jerusalem church in Jerusalem for that 2-year period while Paul was in prison, and that would have been his opportunity to collect a lot of his material.
Yeah, it's very likely.
Also, you can work out from careful reading of the Gospels who Luke's primary sources may have been in some cases. Like, for example, someone mentioned about Mary. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, that he's the only one who records all that detailed information around the birth of Christ. So he probably particularly went to Mary to get that information from her. But you said that John's the only one who claims to be a witness of that. Presumably Matthew would have been a witness as well, being one of the apostles. So
Yeah.
his gospel, the gospel according to Matthew, as it's called, doesn't specifically claim that he was a witness. It's just telling you the story. And Mark is reputedly actually the recollections of the apostle Peter. So Luke's the only one who wasn't of himself an apostle, no, Mark wasn't either. But yeah, there's that connection with Peter.
Yeah, well, there's a number of if, buts and maybes,
Yeah.
because like all four Gospels are anonymous, so the authors don't identify themselves.
John kind of does.
Sorry?
John kind of does.
Well, absolutely, though. Well,
No,
absolutely,
indirectly.
certainly.
But if Matthew, the apostle, was the author, why is he so heavily dependent on Mark?
Well, these are matters for scholarly debate, aren't they?
Yeah.
Some people claim that it's the other way. That Matthew is the first gospel. So traditionally, the church from very early ages saw something primary about Matthew's gospel. There definitely is a lot of correspondence between the gospel according to Matthew and the gospel according to Mark. That's undoubted.
Yeah.
They're the closest two, aren't they? Really?
As I brought out last year, the early church put the Gospels in the order that they thought they were written. And as for the theories these days, there are about a dozen or so theories as to the ordering and how many and whatever. So there isn't not a consensus that they depend on Mark. That was just one of the leading theories of the last century.
Yeah,
That's
so
right.
there are lots of if, buts and maybes.
But also they were, the story was told in oral form before they were written down. And so it's easy for there to be, I suppose, cross-pollination between sources when it's an oral thing before it got into its written form.
It's also thought that one of the theories, it's still only a theory, but it's quite widely held, I think, is that John actually had the other Gospels already in written form when he came to write his, and that is why he is so different from the others. There's the Synoptics, those three, and John stands apart. And it could be that he's supplementing what's in there. That's why his account of all the incidents that do correspond, why his account is so different.
There is only one incident that corresponds, and that's the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah.
And if you look carefully, the details in John are all different to the ones in the other Gospels, aside from a few essential details.
Yeah, so what do you think that means, that John is supplementing what is in the others?
Yes.
Yeah, this could well be. We don't really know, so all we've got is what we've got, isn't it, you know? And
I'm
that's pretty
personally
amazing.
inclined to think he didn't have access to the other Gospels.
Okay.
Because, like, if you look at the Gospels were written with expensive writing materials, and they were very laborious to write, and the process of copying would have taken years, copying and distribution. So you wouldn't expect many copies to be available in the early years. So they would have been very hard to access. So it would have taken around about 50 years before there was wide distribution of the Gospels. And,
Yeah, I think there's... Yeah,
so it'd be unsurprising if he didn't have access.
Yeah, okay. On the other hand, you know, I really feel, I feel that the Gospels were written very, very early. And to me that makes sense, because if the matter that's recorded in the Gospels is something that is absolutely vital and life-changing and more precious than anything else that in my life or whatever, then wouldn't there be a strong incentive, however much it costs and however difficult the materials were, to write things down? So, and for the benefit of the church. And we're not talking here about somebody writing a diary or what they did on their last holiday or something like that. This is the most momentous in the minds of those people who wrote and who were the early believers. This was the most precious thing that had ever happened in the history of the human race. This was something that they were prepared to die for. So wouldn't they write it down?
Well,
I think it'd be a strong incentive to.
However motivated John was to write, and fully, wordily, he was in exile on this little tiny island. And
Well, that was at the end of his life.
Maybe he had real trouble in the supply chain and actually getting materials, not just cost, but simply getting his hand on stuff. He wasn't free to.
He wasn't there for very long, and the theory is that he wrote his gospel while living in Ephesus.
Oh.
And he would have been taking care of Mary.
Yeah, that's right.
As Jesus gave
That's right, he gave
Mary
Mary
into his care at the cross.
Yeah.
He would have had a source in Mary.
Anyway, might be diverting from the topic. Anyway, what did you, not what did you think of my talk, but what did you think of this the material itself, kind of how convincing or unconvincing is it to you, the stuff that I wrote?
I think you put it across very well. You compared one with another to try to come to a consensus of what really took place. We can't make it up. We can only bring forward from what we've got. If the question was what more could we have done, I don't know what more we could do to represent.
Yeah.
Well,
I think what you were saying is that this doesn't prove anything, but it does show clearly that it is a coherent whole and not a hodgepodge of disagreeing, conflicting stories.
Yeah, what I'm saying, there's good evidence that an event took place on which at least the story is based.
Evidence for collaboration, not collusion, was clearly there.
Yeah.
I once heard that, or maybe I read that, only about 15% of the population could read. Is that correct? Do you know?
There's varying opinions on that. Some say the level of literacy is as low as 3%. Other people say that that's...
In which communities? Because I think all the Jews had to be literate and numerate, didn't they?
Ah.
Isn't that one of the characteristics of their culture?
I'm not sure.
I thought the boys were...
Yeah, sorry, yes, quite right, the girls, they get the
The boys went to school till they were
They're the only ones they counted.
Yeah. But, so if you're talking about the Greeks, they might have been very low literacy, but I think Jews were highly educated by comparison.
Oh, okay.
But I think they're different opinions.
But they kept the story circulated because they told them, and they learned to tell the story, and it was only later that it was like, well, we better write this down now. The story is still living in the community, but we better write it down for the future generations.
Yeah, I don't want to take a contrary view, but last time I was in the British Museum, the oldest fragment of the Gospel is actually John, dated 120, something like that, 125. So it's not necessary that it was written last by any... the only evidence we have it was written at earliest. Now, I know it's got a different flavour and a different feel and all that sort of thing, but it's really quite interesting. You kind of, when you look at a tunnel period between when a thing that was written and you actually... Julius Caesar's tunnel period is, 1,500 years or something like that. We've got some old stuff written, it's copies and copies and copies, but John's Gospel, if it was written in its lifetime, say 60 to 90, somewhere in that frame, we've got a tunnel period of 35 years maybe.
For the first fragment.
Extraordinary. So I think actually we needn't be too iffy and doubtful about the dating. And that was a bit in the rubbish dump, if you don't mind, so there must have been some cheap copyists down working somewhere in a sweatshop.
You see, if something was important, people, if they couldn't read and write, they would have scribes. So you would employ someone and you would tell them the story and they would write it, you know? Because most people couldn't read and write. So if you were an important person before you died, you would say, well, I want to get this down, what really happened.
Yeah.
So you might not be able to do it, but I'll tell you what, we'll get someone from university or someone who's knowledgeable who can do it.
Yeah. The accuracy of the text in the Bible are quite high, as we know, I'm sure, because the copyists...
error transition is very small.
That's right, and that really came out with the Dead Sea Scrolls, didn't it? That they took great care in copying and making copies of the text.
Yeah.
And that my understanding was, from my readings, that they used to read biblical text not only in the synagogue but also in the gates of towns and cities as news, or in squares, and so if somebody had been there for the feeding of the 5,000, they would challenge and denounce anything that was read out about the feeding of the 5,000 as being incorrect if it was incorrect. So it had to be true when it was written down, because these were read again and again and again out loud to audiences where sometimes there would have been elderly people who were there at the incident that was being read out who would challenge it if it was wrong. So it had to be accurate at the time.
A common method of writing in those days was on wax tablets. So you had wooden boards with wax on them, and they could reuse them. They just heat the wax and then scratch it in again. And there is a bit of evidence that a lot of the original records were probably Aramaic on wax tablets, which were then translated into Greek, because sometimes you get differences between Matthew and Luke. And if you go back into Aramaic, it's a single letter difference in the word. Like about tithing, Dylan coming. The Matthew and Luke are slightly different on it, and the Aramaic word is, for the two words, is almost identical except for one letter, which was very hard to read on a wax tablet. So there may have been very early written records, scraps written on wax tablets, were then translated into Greek papyrus.
Well, people sit in church, and I saw someone tonight taking notes at a talk, and so those wax tablets might have been informal records by people going, preach it, brother, you know, about Jesus preaching, not necessarily by the apostles that were became famous. But, that's an interesting idea, that someone would just make notes and then, because they're in the short-term records, aren't they, by their nature?
But the whole thing's all about this event, but what did actually Jesus preach? You know, we're not really hearing the message, we're hearing this is what the miracle, you know, this is what happened, you know.
Well,
this was important.
There's some preaching of Jesus up on the screen now.
But they came later.
It came later. Yeah.
Maybe not.
I don't know, he's referring to this bread, you're going to eat this bread and you're still going to die. But if you eat my flesh, and I'm the living bread from heaven, you know. It's sort of, it sounds like he's saying it at the time, on the day.
It's referring back to it. That says it's at Capernaum.
Yeah.
I think it's a different occasion.
A different occasion,
right.
but it's all referring back to it.
Because basically you've got the feeding of 5,000 Bethsaida. They have the crossing. He puts them in the rowboat, and then there's walking on water incident, land at Gennesaret, which is bang next to Capernaum, and then he's in the synagogue.
So why does he say this is the bread that came down from heaven? I wonder what his...
Well, in thought it does tie together, you know, you get all these associations, but the feeding of the 5,000, everybody was very happy with that, you know. They thought that was wonderful, you know.
There's
Then
little
this-
before this that Kevin didn't quote where Jesus specifically relates the facts to feeding the 5,000. You come to me because I gave you all this bread, but
That's right,
Yeah.
it does say that too.
Yeah.
And there's talking about the bread of the Pharisees and
That's right.
The leaven of the
the
Pharisees.
leaven of the Pharisees.
Yeah.
What
That's in Mark.
context was that?
I think that's a different.
That's a different
okay.
That's in
This one here, they came to him and Jesus said, "You come to me because I fed you." And this is when Jesus puts a hard word on them. And so it says, many turned away from following him. They said, this is too hard, we can't follow this. And then Jesus says to them, "But you also go away to the 12. And Peter says, "Well, to whom will we go? You've got the words of eternal life."
See, why were they following? To hear the message, or they've heard Jesus heals the blind, who heals people? Were they coming to see miracles, or were they coming to hear Jesus is actually putting a lot of things together which we didn't understand in a whole different point of view, and this is the really good message, or this is the dead being raised? You know, what was taking place?
Sorry, in the earlier screen, there was, I saw the word the prophet.
Yeah.
And there's all these factors were evidence that Jesus was the prophet that Moses predicted would come, like him, and the only one that was like him, and he was able to do. Moses did amazing miracles, and there's Jesus doing amazing miracles, genuine miracles, you know, even raising the dead, and
Which slide
and
are you
feeding
talking about?
feeding people in the middle of the desert, you know, like man. He's compared just in that screen we had a moment ago. It's compared with manna, you know, the bread in the desert.
Oh, sorry.
So they're saying this. Who else could be the prophet? But this person. This is the one we've been waiting for.
So this was really pointing to Jesus being more than
Oh
a
yeah,
man.
yeah.
See, this was not just the miracle, this was the person producing the miracle. This person is special.
Yeah,
right?
the specific
So
miracles.
this is the miracle pointed to the person.
They're signs, actually. They're signs that he's the prophet that was going to be like Moses.
To me, for me, this is one of the most stunning passages in the Bible.
Yeah.
And also, if we didn't have these miracles before Jesus' resurrection, it might bring the Jesus' resurrection into more question or more doubt. And by having miracles occurring throughout the Gospels, it then reinforces that, hey, this is a common thing with this guy. You know, maybe the resurrection really did happen. So
The miracles and the healings were the reason why people came to be with Jesus.
Yeah.
Crowds followed him, you know, and they gathered at his door, they brought all their sick and their demented and their paralysed and everything, you know, and right all through the Galilean ministry it's like that.
We can't say that everyone came because of this reason. People came to see Jesus for different things. Like the Pharisees and Sadducees, they came for a different reason.
Yeah.
Some of them want to question him,
Yeah.
whether he's the Messiah. So they all came for a different reason. Some of them for healing, some of them for answers, some of them for honor, maybe. You know, the apostles or the disciples.
Well, because everyone else is going then.
They were asking Jesus, give my sons authority. So they came for different reasons.
Yeah.
But if they're looking for the Messiah, they're looking for a leader who's going to conquer the Romans. Someone who can provide food. It's got the job.
That's right.
They'd be watching him for all
And
those
Jesus is
things.
virtually rejecting that sort of
Yes.
approach.
Yeah, it's in the next statement.
Yeah, imagine following a military leader who, if you did get injured or killed, could just raise you or heal you, and you're fit to fight the next day.
Sounds like a video game.
Unbeatable army, you know.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah, it must have seemed wonderful for a while.
But coming back to the topic, undesigned coincidences, like what we observe, people came to Jesus for different things, for different reasons, and this again point that this story is trying to put what happened into a historical context. If we want to tell a story and we want to deliver a point that Jesus is a Messiah, and if this story is a fantasy, it's just purely written to point out that Jesus is the Messiah, it would probably, lead and explicitly say the reason why people came to Jesus is because he's the Messiah. But in this case, we see that the story goes in so many different ways, and people came to Jesus for different reasons, because that's what exactly happened in the history. They saw the signs, they saw Jesus' claim. You know, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they heard Jesus claim to be divine, or he claimed to be the Messiah, and they wanted to question him. And some people came to him for healing. And this is what really happened in the history. They didn't know, is this the Messiah? Is this, who is this person? And that's what people in those days were wondering. Historically, people were confused as today, probably, for a lot of people. They were questioning, and that's what really happened.
I think Jesus still is enigmatic. And so, like we have our cut down versions of the gospel and what we believe, we have our own simplified formulae, but somehow you go back and it doesn't quite fit. And that Jesus is beyond our kind of simple formula.
Yeah. But if we were trying to write a fable, like the race between the tortoise and the rabbit, we don't go into so many different directions. We try to lead people to the point of the story. And that's a fantasy. That's the way of writing a fantasy. We don't say, and the tortoise,
grass there.
He went to that direction and he laid down, the rabbit slept by this tree, and this tree is called something else. They don't wander into so many different directions because it's not historical incident or events that happen. But in here we can see that the story goes in so many different directions, telling this facts and that fact. This is what happened because it's historical.
Yeah. All right, we don't have to go the full distance, so we don't have to just kind of keep on to filling out because we finish at 9. So if you want to ask a question or make a point, then do so. Otherwise, we'll call it quits, call it nights, and you never really know.
Are you telling me that the tortoise didn't win? It's just a fable.
Yeah. What we do have in the four Gospels really does sound like people recounting what happened, and in my view. Yeah. Okay. Well, look. Perhaps we will leave it there. Unless anybody's got another question or comment.
Just to say, like everyone else has said, I really appreciated the way you looked at the corroboration rather than collaboration. I thought that was a lovely phrase.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.